Extended.
Welcome to Film Explorer podcast series Extended. My name is Giuseppe Di Salvatore, editor of Film Explorer, and today we are focusing on video essays for the second edition of Film Explorer Video Essay Gallery. This year, 3 new curators selected 9 video essays and proposed 3 online exhibitions, each showing 3 video essays online on Film Explorer. Don't hesitate to go on Film Explorer Video Essay Gallery to access a free screening of the video essays in the autumn of 2024. The curators are Evelyn Kreutzer, who works at the University of Lugano, Volker, who works at the University of Zurich, and Julian Roos, who works at the Eiffel Museum in Amsterdam. This is the occasion to expand on the practice and the theory concerning videography or the video essays. The titles of the themes of the 3 exhibitions are, respectively, Who Owns an Image, How to Measure the World, Unwatchable. And I let the curators the word.
Well, thank you very much for having us. My name is Evelyn Kreutzer, and on behalf of my co-curators and myself, I'll also like to welcome you all to this conversation. In preparatory conversations that we had, it became clear that a lot of the videos that we were thinking of dealt with questions of ownership, authorship, and archival or material reproduction, which is a topic that I think in light of newest developments around AI-generated imagery also has gained new pertinence, though that's not the main focus of today's conversation. We selected Richard Misek's A History of the World According to Getty Images, Maryam Jafri's Maryam Jafri versus Maryam Jafri, and Das Kino und der Wind und die Fotografie by Harmut Bitomski. I selected Richard Misek's piece on Getty Images as a fairly new video essay about archival reproduction, commercial ethics and aesthetics, and ownership over history that really created quite a buzz last year. And I think it raises a ton of really interesting questions that resonate very well with the other 2 pieces, even though Richard's piece is the newest one in this category. So he deals with Getty Images as obviously a large commercial image library that houses not just many defining images of our time and a lot of stock footage, but also a lot of really iconic and historically important footage that technically should be in the public domain, but for many reasons that Richard goes into in his piece, is actually practically in the possession of Getty, and gets sold for pretty high fees for reproduction rights. So he goes into that line of inquiry. How come a commercial enterprise like Getty gets to have a hold on these images that really are part of our shared, or should be part of our shared history, and should be accessible in the public domain? So that's my suggestion for this round, and I'll hand it over to Julian to talk about his selection.
Great, thank you. So my selection was Maryam Jafri versus Maryam Jafri by Maryam Jafri from 2019. Maryam Jafri, her name is spelled with a Y, M-A-R-Y, but she was miscredited in a particular Getty Images stock photograph as Maryam with an I, so M-A-R-I. So even though phonetically it sounds the same, those 2 names, they are different, and that becomes the kind of beginning of this interrogation around, who owns an image, who owns a name, etc., that this artist, Maryam Jafri, explores in this work. I'm going to read short text I wrote to kind of introduce this work for the International Film Festival Rotterdam, where I used to work as a film programmer. On their website, my text is still present, but my name is not. And I thought that kind of is evocative of what we're discussing here about who owns different sorts of production. So this was my production in words, I suppose. Literary would be too much, I think, yet I'm not credited. So here we go. Delivered in poker-faced monotone, Maryam Jafri examines ownership in our age of image circulation. Step by step, with humor and persistence, she walks us through the licensing conundrum of her ready-made sculpture that transforms from object for sale into artwork for sale, photo for sale, and finally a video for sale with superimposed watermarks.
Wonderful. And the watermarks will be a recurring motif too, I think. Volker, you're up next.
Okay, thanks so much, Evelyn. Thanks, Julian. Thanks to everyone. I picked a rather old piece from 1991 by Hartmut Bitomski. The English title would translate as Cinema, the Wind and Photography, and it has a subtitle too, 7 chapters on documentary film. It's by far the longest piece in this selection. It would be 56 minutes, and it was done for television in 1991. I think the question of copyright is much more implicit in this piece than in the others, and we can talk about this later maybe. But I thought it was interesting to include a piece that also comes from a different era, a proto or pre-digital era. So this is from the electronic age, where it's all about VHS tapes and other things. And what Bitomski and his collaborators does is he shows clips from documentary cinema, quite canonized clips, I would say, from Lumière via Flaherty, Joris Evans and others, to Robert Gardner, Robert Frank and others, and then has lots of reflections about these. And the interesting thing is, and this connects it, I think, to some of the other pieces, is that he really shows this as a process, not as a product of thinking, but as a process where the books, the photographs, the VHS tapes are very much performed, or it's a performance that uses those to develop certain thoughts about this. And there's one section, maybe this can lead us to a general questions about this, where he talks about Dziga Vertov, who prefers to use hidden camera when he did his films. And Vertov says something, he regrets that people change when they realize that they are filmed. And then Bitomski says, I think that by doing so, the people who are filmed, reclaim their right to their own image. And I think that's an interesting statement coming from 1991, quite early, to have this conscience that this could also be a conception of ownership when it comes to the image. Why isn't it the people who are in the image that are also the owners of the image? And I think that's also present in, at least in Maryam Jafri. It was one of those moments that struck me as a potential connection between those pieces. One footnote maybe, since Bitomski's film is not online and since it's not readily available and it doesn't usually have English subtitles, I resorted to like an idea that mimics his idea maybe. So there's a YouTube version with English subtitle, very poor quality, so a bit like the UbuWeb style to show it in. And so I'm going to film a section of 10 minutes from this work. So it's kind of a mediated form that you are going to be able to watch with Bitomski's piece.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both. And the passage in the Bitomski film that you just mentioned is also one that I wrote down that to me connects all 3 pieces. And I wrote down 3 statements from the 3 respective videos that speak to each other. And the first one you just stated as well, when he talks about the Recht am eigenen Bild, right, to one's own image. And Jafri at some point declares, we have no right to our own image, not as an appeal, but as a reflection on what she's experienced with her own art. And Misek speaks of his attempt to release the images from captivity, which is a quite strong statement here as well. And Richard Misek does so by, he actually bought the rights to a number of short films, historical films from Getty Images to then reproduce them. He calls it, he paid the ransom for these films to then reproduce them in his film, unedited, uncut, unaltered, and then making his film available for reproduction, for downloading, etc. So that's his attempt to release the power of Getty and to release these images. And that prompted me to think more generally, or across the 3 pieces, what the meta performance or the meta power move, if you want to call it that, from all 3 might be understood as here. So Richard's move is quite clear. This is a sort of guerrilla attempt to release those images back into the public domain. But arguably, you could also ask, well, what kind of power does he have to be able to do so, right? And what does that speak to, or what kind of power dynamics does this speak to? I'd be curious to hear what either of you think about this meta aspect, meta position, meta performance of your filmmakers.
Well, I think Mariam Jaffrey does something similar in the sense that her artwork is photographed by Getty, well, a photographer, and yeah, is sold as a stock photo for licensing on the Getty Images website, right? And what she does is she basically remediates that photograph into her video work, and then in turn sells that video work as an artwork on the art market. So in that sense, there's a similar power game taking place between Mariam Jaffrey and Getty Images, although I'm not so sure if Getty Images is aware of being a player in this game. Yeah, so I guess I should have explained a little bit more about how this work came about, which is that Mariam Jaffrey presented a work of hers, a ready-made sculpture called Anxiety, in the Frieze Art Fair in 2017. And although it's an art fair, it was reviewed by a writer in The Guardian, so a newspaper, and the accompanying photograph for the review was a photograph of Mariam Jaffrey's work. So that's how this ended up in the photograph itself became available for people to see, and the work itself became available for people to see outside of the art fair, right? And yeah, without anybody seeking her permission, her work, a photograph of her work ends up for sale by Getty Images. So that's the kind of conundrum she finds herself in. But she kind of also reflects on whether, she owns this artwork in the first place, because it's actually a ready-made sculpture to kind of fake feet, which she found in a sex shop. She purchased in a sex shop. So it was, made by somebody else, based on somebody else's feet, which she kind of places as a, ready-made object in the context of an art fair and an art market. So yes, it kind of provokes a reflection on, who actually owns this artwork in the first place, who can be credited for this artwork in the first place. Yeah.
And I think you could maybe provocatively ask then, what are the ethical implications, comparing Richard's move of taking this commercially appropriated or possessed footage and releasing it back into the public domain, as opposed to what Jaffrey is doing, which is take a commercially produced object and then turn it into this art object that is not commercially implicated in the same way. But why do we, I think we all have a gut feeling about which move seems more ethically okay than the other, but it's a question we could pose. Why is that so?
I think it's interesting that maybe it's something like two different sides of a coin. One is the empowerment side of the coin, that you kind of get to be the one who owns the images that you have been disappropriated or expropriated before, and then you kind of reappropriate them. But then on the other hand, of course, we know that appropriation is quite a contested term also. I mean, it's not about like only appropriation and then it's fine. And what struck me in what you've both said is that maybe sometimes we take it for granted that the legal questions are tied to economical and financial questions, but maybe this wouldn't necessarily have to be the case, right? Because the ethical question is also in the game. And we could, of course, I mean, it's a utopia, but I think in the liner notes to his piece, Richard Misek also develops this. He says there could be an internationally agreed law that requires all archives to make all digitized public domain images in their collections freely available to the public. And then he adds, this is unlikely ever to happen, which is probably true. So there could be a world where other types of value are attached to those images, not necessarily financial value. It could be historical value, educational value, all these things. But that's I think one question that all those three works they put on the table. And in Mariam Jaffrey's work, there's also this idea that the artist, I mean, she is paid to some extent, and she says the artist's pay is the privilege to engage in non-alienated labor, which is not, I mean, it's very hard to live on this kind of payment, but I think it belongs also to a certain type of artist's image or stereotype that we have gotten used to, that you accumulate like cultural capital or it's symbolic capital, and that's why you're not properly paid in the first place. And so I think all those three works, they negotiate those different aspects. Like there's a legal framework in all these cases. There's some kind of legal framework, but then there's all these other financial, ethical, moral questions attached to it. And I think one of the great things about them is that it shows how complicated it is, how many different stakeholders are in the game. And that's what I really enjoyed about the Maryam Jafreh piece, which is very simple. I mean, we should maybe also mention this, that it's basically, it's not, first of all, I thought it's just going to be this single photograph, which is going to stay there all the time with the Getty watermark in it and the name of the photographer. But then in the end, she brings in a YouTube clip from a different performance or a presentation that she did on Ghana versus Getty, or Getty versus Ghana. I forgot which order. And in this is really great when this comes in, because the whole question takes on a different dynamic altogether when you see that in this case, where official images of the Ghana that belong to the Ghana state have also been appropriated by Getty, and all of a sudden it's also a global north versus the global south question, etc. So it's not about her individual case. It's really exemplary for lots of different dynamics, and it's hard to lose track. I admit it's hard to lose track, and it's very intricate legal questions also, where I think I would need much more, I don't know, literacy in those questions also.
Yeah, maybe to quote Maryam Jafreh, she in the work itself, she says it just goes on and becomes horribly complicated. And I think yeah, that's true for all three works who are presented here, at least in relation to questions around copyright and ownership. Maybe just a few more words about the Getty versus Ghana work and performance lecture that you mentioned, Volker. It's part of a series that she called Versus series that she made between 2012 and 2015. So this kind of battle with Getty Images has been going on for like almost 10 years by the point when she makes Maryam Jafreh versus Maryam Jafreh. And here she, as you described in the case of Ghana, but also in other cases of African nations and their Independence Day photographs, she goes to the Getty image copyrighted photograph and presents it, for example, at an exhibition alongside the official photograph of that country in their own archives, and they're, you know, basically identical. And it brings up questions of like who owns, you know, the image of such an important event for these African nations, and yeah, it's their Independence Day. And again, this kind of global South dynamic entangled with colonialism, right? And even their independence from colonial powers are kind of taken away by this multinational, I think American originally, agency.
I'm starting to think now that since this image of the sculpture, a Jafreh sculpture that she lingers on for such a long time, therefore also lingers in my mind now. In a way, you could say that in this image, we see the feet of this sex doll that she bought. And in a way, that kind of could be a stand-in to the role of the image in this discussion, where it's the feet divorced from the assumed body that is attached to it, put in a very different context. And of course, that's also a feminist emancipatory gesture in that. But depending on which literal or virtual space you put these feet, this object in, the context changes the meaning of the image completely, and the ownership and the rights to the image completely. And that's something that happens in all three videos, and really makes me think about these very complicated layers and the layering process of how an individual image gets altered, even when it doesn't technically get altered, as in Richard's case, which is his conscious move. But both Richard and Maryam Jafreh play with the watermark and how that is an imprint of ownership onto an image that we're supposed to ignore. And then, of course, in your take on the Bitomsky piece, Volker, you're adding a whole layer with your own performance. Maybe you want to talk a little bit more about that if you like.
I can do this, and I can also provide maybe a bit more context, picking up the question of different systems maybe in which these three works are involved. I think it's interesting that the Maryam Jafri piece, it's set at an art fair, so the economic context is there right from the get-go, which is very interesting. The Richard Misek one is, I think first of all, it's an online community in which this piece is being made, but then he also comments on the website on what happens when this enters a festival circuit. I think he mentions that they renegotiated the licensees, or they paid some extra money to make it safe, to save it in a festival circuit, because all of a sudden there is some kind of other type of value that comes into it. And with the Bytomsky piece, I think the TV context at this particular moment, at the beginning of the 1990s, is interesting because the questions of economy and the value of those film clips becomes more and more pressing. Bytomsky, he was able to do a piece, a 90-minute video essay or television essay on John Ford in 1976, and he exclusively used John Ford's films. So 90 minutes of John Ford films, and nobody cared. He just used them, he quoted them. And then in the 1980s in Germany, private television comes into the equation, and also the licenses like Leo Kirch and others, they become aware that there's financial value in those archival assets that they have, and all of a sudden it becomes more complicated. And I think for the whole setup, the dispositif that he devises for this film, Das Kino, der Wind und die Fotografie, I think it's not exclusively financial reasons, but I think it's one reason, the copyright question is one reason why he decides not to show the clips just full screen, but to enter them or to make them enter into this work setting. And I think it's a very interesting way, which is like a desktop. I mean, it is a desktop documentary, an electronic desktop documentary with the VHS tapes and everything being manually fed into the players, etc. But it's a way of saying, okay, this is quotes. This is just quotes. And I have a quote from one of the commissioning editors, Werner Dütsch, who was one of the people who made all these great works by Farocki and others possible. And he says that they had an interesting legal situation at the time. He says, 1985, Germany's biggest film dealer, Leo Kirch, loses a lawsuit in the second instance against the Südwestfunk in Baden-Baden. Without buying the rights, the channel had used more than 5 minutes of a single film in one of its programs. The court verdict, so this was against Leo Kirch in this case, the court verdict became a guideline for us. The lawyers at our own WDR had previously assured us that film clips as constituent part of a program were not regarded as quotes. Now they supported us as long as we could plausibly explain that and how we used a clip as a quote. So the question, which is quite pressing for everyone who does videographic work and does video essays, is it a quote? How do I make sure that it's seen as a quote? I think in this case, it's the video recorders and the monitors, right? Once there's a monitor, you can always say the monitor is the quotation marks. And this is also, to come back to your question, this is why I thought, okay, I might be on the safe side legally if I film Bytomsky's clip from my screen and kind of update this from today's vantage point. I'm not sure. Maybe Leo Kirch is going to sue me or WDR is going to sue me, but I don't think so.
They probably don't think you're dangerous enough to really infringe too much. But yeah, this is also, without sidetracking here too much, this is something that comes up a lot when you talk about copyright in the German context, in the European context, where we speak of the Zitatrecht, right? The right to cite, as opposed to what we think of fair use in the American and international context, where there's an interesting, weird contrast between this idea of as long as you cite it properly and in its integrity, so to speak, you're safe, as opposed to saying as long as you add a criticality to it in the fair use idea, that's proper use, as opposed to just showing or reproducing. I mean, personally, I don't really think those distinctions work at all, and certainly not in our time. And most people working with videographic methods, these days, especially in a scholarly context, I think apply a fair use principle to what they do. But we're still in a weirdly dubious arena here, and I think the three pieces really reflect that.
It's interesting that, I mean, the Misek piece, it really made me aware, maybe for the first time, that the label public domain doesn't mean that much as long as it's not available also. Like he has this distinction between public domain, which is valuable for everything which has been around for a long time or which hasn't had any copyright in the first place, like those like the NASA clips or the government clips. But then if it's not in the public realm, it's still completely invisible. It doesn't exist for the public. And this is an interesting situation. And I really like his activist take on it, the one you quoted, like to release, to liberate those images, to pay a ransom, etc., to get them from their kidnapped situation. And when I looked up a little around the Misek film, I also got aware, I think in one of the comments maybe on Vimeo, where he says that after he had made this film, he only got aware that the legislation in Europe, where he's based, is different from the one in the US. So since he has made this work in Europe, he could have just put the Getty clips online, because as he says, in Europe, copyright law trumps contract. So even if you have a contract with Getty, the copyright law is stronger, the public domain idea is stronger, so that if a clip is public domain, you can use it however you like, regardless of any license that you signed. But in the US, it's the other way around. So to me, this brings up the question, what does this mean? I mean, is it purely based on the fact where you are and where you produce this clip? Would this be Swiss legislation for Evelyn and me? It would be Netherlands and Dutch legislation for you, Julian, or European Union in this case. This makes it even more complicated, I think. Maybe for the benefit of things, if it's so much more liberal in Europe than in the US. But it's an interesting question, which shows me that even if we're in such a globalized world and those images seem to be everywhere at the same time, the law that applies is very different regarding on where you are and what you do with those images, of course.
And then on top of all of that, I mean, aside from the fact that I think it's quite hard to prove where you've produced a piece, because I could easily also just claim, oh yeah, I produced it in the US under fair use policies when, you know, in fact, I was in Berlin or in Switzerland. But then on top of it, you also have this issue of the platforms and websites that host the videos that we upload, as long as we don't have our own servers to do so. If you put it on Vimeo or on YouTube, Vimeo and YouTube can apply their own specific copyright guidelines that really have very little legal ties to any specific government or country or policies. And this has happened to a lot of video essay scholars and makers lately, that their videos have been taken down from Vimeo, for example, for supposed copyright infringements, even when people made clear claims why their work neither violated any federal laws nor the Vimeo policies, in fact. But this is also the work of AI, right? Like it's not like people manually go through our video essays, go to In Transition and check our video essays for copyright issues. And this becomes really murky and quite frustrating too.
Evelyn, you're so much more an insider of this world. I mean, I would also guess that this whole question of AI and artificial intelligence just scraping the net for all these instances, that this is a game changer. Do you think this will result in much more severe cases and like in, yeah, or does it menace? Is there a threat to videographic practice that comes with this enhanced activity of searching the web and getting more precise in these things?
I mean, I really don't know, and I'm no legal expert. My sense is that it's gotten much worse in the last few months, even just the amount of videos that are being taken down for these supposed but actually incorrect copyright infringements. And at the same time, I mean, there's the greater threat of AI to just replace the kind of analytical work that we do, that kind of lingers on top of all of that. And at the same time, but this is coming not from a legal standpoint, but more from a philosophical standpoint, I think AI has to completely change what we consider as image ownership in the first place. I mean, like we're obviously already in a long postmodern point of questioning original and copy and this distinction, but generative AI really, like, that's the cherry on top. It's how can you still claim ownership to any kind of images on this scale of datafication of imagery? I don't think that's the philosophical question that big AI tech companies are concerned with, but it's certainly something that I think all of us will be dealing with or already are dealing with.
I think it brings up some interesting questions. I'm thinking again of Mariam Jaffrey and her kind of realization where she, during the work in the voiceover, where, you know, she starts questioning, actually, is this work even mine? Because, you know, I use somebody else's work as a ready-made sculpture. And that's kind of an interesting positioning, because it's like, is what Getty Images doing really that different from what I'm doing as an artist? And I think you can apply the same maybe logic to you know, AI here versus, let's say, video essayists. Are they that different? They are taking other people's images and then, you know, puking something else out and then claiming, oh, this is a new thing. And I think, you know, not to kind of, you know, I think I'm being too kind of binary there, but in a sense, it's an interesting dilemma, because when, you know, a video essayist might get frustrated about the current situation with AI, the artist making that original image might be saying, hey, but you aren't so different from what these AI platforms are doing.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, I think this is simply yet another chapter in this long, long trajectory of what Erica Balsam has called like the promise and the threat of reproducibility. There's always like the promise side to it. Okay, now things are available, things can be copied, nothing's lost, etc. And then all of a sudden, this deterritorializing dynamic gets countered by some kind of barrier that is then erected. But on the other hand, I think, I mean, since all this lingers on the notion of ownership, and ownership is something that is quite central to the system that we live in, I think the corporations that have put AI into the world, they will also come up with ideas how to keep and to secure the notion of ownership, despite of all those troubles that come with it. So, I mean, I don't want to put my hopes into capitalism to save ownership. Things get very mixed up at that point in time. But yeah, it's really an interesting moment, since I'm not sure. Parts of the AI thing are a certain hype, of course, also. But it's true what you said, Evelyn, that it really seems to undermine certain notions of ownership in a much more fundamental way than we are used to, than any simple copying act has ever done.
At the same time, of course, it's worth mentioning that, especially with the ready-made making an appearance, or the concept of the ready-made making an appearance in the Jaffrey piece, that at its core, this is a very old question in art that we've been dealing with for at least 100 years. And we have this entire history of modern and postmodern art where the ownership or the idea of authorship is much more tied to the context of production, or even more so exhibition, rather than the source of the object itself, to put it in very general terms. And I mean, as far as I know, for a very long time, the highest selling art photograph internationally was a photograph by Richard Prince, where he just took a photograph of a printed Marlboro ad in a magazine. And this was in the 80s, I believe. Don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure that was the case. So obviously this is a recurring phenomenon. And actually, on a very general basis, I think there's always a bit of a problem with this hyper focus on context and conceptual context, where then we tend to overlook the actual images or objects that are placed in that context to some extent, or I think that's a risk. And I'm realizing now too that in all of my talk about the Richard Misek piece, I haven't really spoken about the concrete footage that he reproduces. You know, I haven't mentioned that he reproduces iconic footage of the Hindenburg crash and an early actuality film by the Miles brothers from San Francisco. We haven't really talked much about which films Tomsky reproduces. So that's just as a meta reflection on our own conversation. That's something that's noteworthy, perhaps.
There's maybe, I don't want to sidetrack the discussion, but there's one element in the Witomski piece that might be worth mentioning in our context. I think it's interesting that it's a collective piece. Even, I mean, it's very ambiguous because Witomski is so present with his voice, and the others are more like subaltern people handing him the stuff that he works with. But still, it's coming from an educational context. It's mostly people studying with him at Deutsche Film- und Fernsehakademie Berlin. There's Christian Petzold, there's the Swiss actor Ronny Tanner, etc. And all those people are involved. And of course, collectivity and collective work historically also has been some kind of an alternative to ideas of individual authorship, right? So and I wonder if this happens in videographic film work. I mean, it's very I think in teaching videographics it does. Usually there's in many cases there's groups working together on a video essay, and it's really distributed kind of intelligence that flows into it. But in I think the Misek and the Mariam Jafri piece, they rely on this strong subject position also. I mean, those two people in Miriam Jafri's case, it's what happened to her. You cannot just put her out of the equation. And in Misek's piece, it's also interesting and important that he's the one who kind of propagates and promotes this idea. But maybe this idea of collectivity would be interesting also to consider in terms of ownership. Then who owns these images that were made collectively in the first place?
Yeah, and they're named as well, these the other people present in the work. But I guess with AI, it is kind of a collectively produced images, but it's not presented as such. It's kind of and the kind of visible quotation marks that we talk about. We've been talking about with these three works, whether that means the watermark of Getty or the desktops, the visible monitors, and the Witomski work that gets erased in AI production, right? It takes the images but doesn't quote them. So gradually, we're not going to see those traces of the provenance of these images.
So perhaps in addition to this question of who owns an image or who authors an image, of course, there's also the very strong implied question of who benefits or profits from an image. And in this academic context, you could say that for many of us, it's still important to claim authorship or perhaps single authorship on something because it has career implications and generates revenue or credit in various different ways. And that's certainly a phenomenon in the art world that also goes back quite a while. You often had these wonderful guerrilla art collectors, and as soon as someone has something like mainstream success in some form, then all of a sudden the single authorship gets applied more. I think that's an historical thing for sure.
Maybe it's just a footnote. I had the question when I watched Mariam Jafri versus Mariam Jafri. Is she independent in the sense that she also deals with her, she's responsible for selling her work, etc.? Because I thought if there was a gallery involved in some way or another, it would be interested what the gallery's position is in such a case of who owns the image. Right? That's yet another player. But when I looked at her website, I had the impression that she's the person, and she's not like a puppet or somehow related to a gallery that would then claim her rights for her. Do you know this, Julian?
No, I don't have a direct answer to whether she has gallery representation or not, but this work was co-commissioned by two galleries or art spaces. One is Taxis Palais, Kunsthalle Tirol, and the Contemporary Art Gallery of Vancouver. So yeah, these were commissioned artwork. This was a commissioned artwork, and it circulated a little bit in film festivals. So yeah, these questions of copyright and where it's produced and where it's presented continue to be complicated when you kind of trace the journey of not just the production of the work, but where it's ended up as well.
As an editor, I would like now to ask you something to you as curators, because I think that the example of Getty Images can also help us to shift a bit focus from ownership to curation. Because actually, if I understand well, probably you can correct me, but sometimes the ownership of the images remain in the public archives, for example, and Getty just take the copyrights and have some compensation actually for its work on curating. In a sense, to curating the images, taking care of the images. That's triggers me a question about curation of images, and a videographist or video essayist is also a curator of images, and you now selecting these video essays, you are also curators. So in a sense, you can be attacked for using or showing images that you are not allowed, or there are copyright question, but you could probably also even turn the argument, say, actually, we are curating these images that could get lost or forgotten, and in a sense, ask you as curator some compensation for showing these images. So, I mean, it's a bit a tricky argument, but I don't know, how do you see yourself as curators concerning, I mean, not the ownership, but the benefit, the question of the benefit of the images?
In a sense, putting together, like, let's say, a film program or an exhibition with all these various works is also taking some kind of social capital, and hopefully in most cases some financial benefit as well as a curator, right? Because you're taking artists' work from them and placing it into a context that you've created. And okay, you're juxtaposing it with something else perhaps, but nevertheless, you're taking somebody else's images and making it in some way your own. So I think it's an interesting question, a provocative question, right? Is a curator being a bit like Getty Images, taking these images. But I mean, I can say for all of us, we've reached out to the artists who are the owner of the images, except for the Bytomsky case, I suppose. And we are offering a albeit small, but artist fee for the presentation of the work. So at least the original creator of these works are aware and have benefited a little bit, we hope, from our curatorial presentation.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I wouldn't consider myself as a curator. Maybe I'm an accidental curator, just as Didi Chica has come up with the term accidental archivist. I'm also an accidental archivist. But it's true. I mean, I think to some extent we have to acknowledge that the material that everyone as a curator chooses from has always existed in different markets. There's always been a black market or a gray market of films, videos, moving image works, be it VHS tapes that circulate from hand to hand, be it shadow libraries on the internet, etc. And then there's the regular market. And I think the question is always how to negotiate those two markets. If you come across something and you like it, and this was always Kenneth Goldsmith's idea, I think. We put things on UbuWeb in rotten quality, but if someone picks it up and thinks, wow, this is interesting, he or she goes to Electronic Arts Intermix or to Lightcone and then rents the film on a regular basis. So then the real market is involved. And the question of in how far we also benefit from it, yes, I think we should acknowledge this and be as transparent as possible about these things. And of course, curating also means gatekeeping, picking this and not picking something else, which might be just as important, just as interesting, etc. So the only thing we can do is to somehow do this in a sensible and sensitive manner, I guess.
Yeah, I think that last point is really important. I'm not really concerned, both as a curator and a video essayist or found footage filmmaker. I'm not really concerned with my power over the images that I reproduce, in the sense that would in any way be comparable to Getty Images, because I don't have enough power and definitely don't have enough reach with my work. But more importantly, I never, and we don't do this in this project either, we're not reproducing any material that we then take any kind of exclusive rights to. You know, I'm not taking it out of circulation elsewhere to then place it within the specific circulation I have ownership over. It's always a reproduction that's a plus, an and, as opposed to instead. And I think that's a really key difference. And that's the opposite of what Getty Images is doing with these public domain images, which should be accessible and technically, in a legal sense, are accessible or should be owned by all of us. But in fact, it's sort of a finders keepers principle. Like, no, but we found it. We found a high quality version of it. Of course, yes, we did digitize it. We refurbished it and all of that. That's labor for sure. But there's no reason to then keep it out of reach for anyone else. And that's quite different from what we're doing here. But I do think in terms of a more conceptual idea of ownership, archiving, etc., this question of reproducing an archival or a canonical logic that is already inherent and problematic in the material that we're dealing with, I think that's a really important one. And also, by the way, important one in terms of this whole debate about generative AI. Are we reproducing the flaws, the biases, the problems already inherent in our image culture in this new way? And yeah, that's certainly also something that is relevant to Richard Misak's piece, I think. Which canonical or not canonical films does he pick to buy and then release into the world, right? Perhaps this is a good time to end this conversation. Thank you both for having this conversation with me as well. And I will just mention that there will be 2 more conversations we'll have, and we'll continue next time with the topic how to measure the world, including video essays that play with and reflect on this idea of measurement, scale, tracking, datafication, etc.
Extended.